Welcome to Alas Vine and Hitchens. I'm Sarah Vine.
And I'm Peter Hitchens.
And before we get started, it turns out, Peter, that we have some listeners, which is very exciting.
I think it's an absolute joy.
And they also like to email and leave notes, and you're going to read the first one.
Which runs as follows. Dear Vine and Hitchens, when I was younger and we'd visit my grandma on Sundays, she'd often be sat in front of the TV, but it would be turned off. I always found this strange and couldn't get my head around why. Now that I'm older and hopefully wiser, I too sometimes sit there with the TV off, often listening to the radio or doing something else. But when I was a kid, I always felt that if you were at home, the TV had to be on even if you weren't watching it. Although she never said it, I'm sure my grandma knew the TV wasn't meant to be constantly spewing its rubbish. The moral of the story, we should take note of our elders, and that's from Chris from Nottingham.
Well, that's very, very wise, but also, I should just say that was in response to our
Yes, it is interesting.
discussion last week about television and how it should not have been invented, which is your view.
The television has replaced a fireplace, which used to be the centre of everybody's
Well, you do
life.
know that you can also, if you go to YouTube, you can get a video of an actual fire that you can have on your TV so that you can make it into a fireplace.
Not the same, I'm afraid. Anyway, thank you for the thought.
Just in case. I use it at Christmas when I'm trying to feel Christmassy.
Do you?
Yeah, just to annoy my children. We've got another one. Dear all, I enjoy listening to the podcast, as usual. I don't watch anything on TV that is from the last 30 to 40 years, as whenever I try and watch something new or relatively modern, I never seem to enjoy it. I would echo Peter's wish to uninvent TV in a different context with my own wish that the internet would never have been invented. The irony for me is that I would have had to have done a different job to my present employment as it is concerned with computers and online learning. And that is from, Tony Bilney. Can I just say briefly, I agree with Tony. I'd like to be able. I think we should have a rule in the country that the Prime Minister switches the internet off at 10 o'clock at night so everybody can go to bed for a bit. And it should be like, when they switch on in America where they have the finance, the world of finance, and they have the bell that starts trading. The Wall Street Journal. Yes. I think we should have the opposite.
New York Stock Exchange
I think
bell.
we should have that too. I think we should have someone switching off the internet at about 10 o'clock and then
This reminds me
turning
of
it
a
on
nursery
again at
rhyme.
6.
Wee Willie Winky runs through the town. Are the children in their beds? Remember that one?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think I fancy that at all.
Oh, no. Okay, fine. Well, then we won't do that. Tony carries on and says, it was interesting that Sarah chose HMRC as her topic, as they have been causing me concern over the last few months due to having to pay tax on unearned interest on savings. I've now done this, but it has taken 3 phone calls to HMRC to ask why it's not been updated, as it has affected my tax code. The last HMRC advisor assured me things would be sorted before the next payday. The advisors were polite. Advice from an internet search said to ring at 8 a.m. when they open their line, so you won't have to wait too long. He carries on, poor man. After contacting 4 accountants and 1 lawyer for help, I only received 1 reply saying it was out of their scope, ironically, again from a firm that said they dealt with tax problems. I have been informed that unless I was a client with an accountant, they would not be interested in even replying, as it was too easy a problem for them. Someone mentioned to me that at the moment HMRC are in some disarray. I would guess from what Sarah has reported, plus my own experience, that this would be right. And I think that's true. I think there's a lot of work from homeism going on at HMRC.
Well, it is. I think it's not just HMRC either. If you read the excellent Sally Sorted column in the Daily Mail, the number of private companies which treat their clients and customers appallingly is quite shocking. And the brilliance with which she sorts it out, by the way, is also admirable. But we also have another letter here, this time from Alex, on a number of things, actually. How delightful, Alex writes, to finally have a weekly source of Mr. Hitchens and to be introduced to the superb Sarah Vine. As a member of the so-called millennial generation, the idea of subscribing to a newspaper in order to get a regular dose simply does not occur. When it does, it seems laughably expensive, so this podcast has become a must-listen. I say to you, Alex, it isn't actually that expensive. I mean, everything in the world is behind a paywall. Your breakfast is behind a paywall. The BBC is behind a paywall. Everything you do is, it really isn't actually much of a stretch. You might find that if you actually took out a subscription, you would be glad you'd done it.
Can't believe Peter telling off one of our listeners.
Well, no, I'm not telling him off. I think this is I used to be a bit sceptical about people taking out subscriptions to newspapers, but actually I think it's very important. And I'll diverge here from the letter because I think it's so important. if you don't have independent newspapers, then you can't live in a free country, because there has to be some source of criticism and holding to account in our society, which newspapers alone can provide. They can only do it if they're commercially successful. They can only be commercially successful if people buy them.
Completely agree.
And what's happening in this country is that this very important part of our constitution, the fourth estate, is declining because people are not buying newspapers anymore. And the only way it can be brought back to full life is if people start subscribing. And it really isn't very expensive. And I think it doesn't matter which newspaper you do it to, though obviously I prefer if you did it to ours, but if people don't do this, then actually freedom dies, as the great slogan of the Washington Post is, freedom dies in silence. And one of the great guarantees against there being no silence is newspapers. So do subscribe, I would say.
You're going to read the rest of his
I'm
letter?
going to leave it there because I think I've given him enough of a browbeating.
Were you going to read his letter? No.
Well, that was the letter.
No, that wasn't the letter.
Was my response to it.
He wrote lots of things that were more interesting than what you just said.
Well, do you want to read them out then if you find this?
Okay, so he says, having been brought up in the last age of traditional television dominance, my parents were careful with what television, but the amount of dross and endless adverts for credit cards was appalling. As a parent myself now, traditional TV is alien to my children and they almost never see advertising at home. Streaming has meant we only watch the best of what's on offer without ads in small bursts. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? That we were talking about.
It's true, but advertising is coming on streaming now.
Yes.
They started without it, but they're going to start pouring it.
But that idea that you don't do the sort of linear TV watching anymore.
No, it's true, but people don't. It's
people
just
watch what they want.
Apart from the over 70s like me, that people don't do that, and I don't do it either. So who does it?
I do it for the Antiques Roadshow, which is one of my favourite programmes, which I love to watch.
This is what makes me realise that I am probably an alien. I have no idea why anybody would watch Antiques Roadshow.
It's entertaining. And we have one final contributor, which is, I think, a voice note.
Alas, I've really enjoyed the podcast with Sarah Vine and Peter Hitchens. I think each episode is very thought-provoking, and I love the balance that they both bring to the table. I would love to hear what they think on the state of the university system in England at the moment, and how the fees for tuition are going up and up each year, and how for the average person that doesn't want to get into an unsurmountable amount of debt, how the barrier to entry is quite high. And I'd love to hear also what they think about funding apprenticeships, especially from those big taxes that they spoke about before, like how some of that money could potentially be used to fund apprenticeships. Love to hear what they think on that. Have a good day.
Well, that was from Mona. Interesting series of questions there. I have two children at university. One is about to finish, one is in their first year. So I have some experience of the modern university experience. And I have to say it's very different from, I think, probably what you and I went through. Where did you go to? Was it Moscow Polytechnic?
No, I went to I did go to the Oxford College of Further Education after I left school at 15. I then went to the University of York, which was what was one of then the new plate glass universities. And spent 3 years there, basically learning Marxism and Leninism, which I'm still very good at.
What was your subject?
It's officially philosophy and politics.
Okay.
I know nothing about either of those.
Well, I went to UCL and I did modern languages, which was a 4-year degree, because you had to do a year abroad. And it was great. It was fun. It wasn't particularly intellectually stimulating, I didn't think. But most of my time pursuing a part-time job at the Body Shop in Oxford Street.
Heavens. Well, my time at York was immensely stimulating, intellectually and personally, and I had a great time of it, haranguing public meetings.
Did you go on a lot of marches?
I went on a few marches, though my view is, again, this is a Marxist-Leninist thing. It was pointed out to me by one of the older comrades quite early on, you never ever see, for instance, the British Road Federation or the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders or the banks going on demonstrations. They don't need to. Demonstrations are demonstrations of impotence, and they're emotional spasms of no real value or interest. So no, I wasn't doing that. I was stirring up industrial strife and trying to recruit other students to the revolutionary cause, and also advancing myself while doing so.
What was your aim? Because I always felt
my aim was to have a social revolution in this country, which would transform it into what I then thought would be a better place.
Because I always felt at university that there were lots of people who were like you and wanted a revolution, but it was never quite clear what they wanted or why they wanted it. And I used to think quite often that the reason they were doing it was mainly because they wanted to sleep with girls.
Well, who doubts that people...
Because there was the whole sort of Che Guevara, I'm a dark-eyed revolutionary.
Do that, and girls were and are important. But it wasn't entirely about that. I don't think anybody, either now or in the 1960s and 1970s, could look at the world or this country and think that it was satisfactorily arranged.
Yeah, fair
Anybody
enough.
with anything remotely resembling a heart must look at these things and think, good heavens, this is a mess, and desire to change it. And when you're 17, 18, 19, 20, then you think that the change is quite straightforward. And also you see that the reason why you grasp for revolutionary politics is because you see the difficulties, if you're intelligent, of what will be involved. And you conclude, therefore, that some sort of violent or at least unconstitutional eruption is probably going to be necessary to achieve them. What the revolutionaries of my era learned was that, in fact, you could achieve your revolutionary ends by subtle and backdoor means, which is what most of them did. I stopped being revolutionary about 2 or 3 years after I left university. They didn't. They carried on, and they have transformed the country.
It's very interesting. I have a very old friend from university, Lucy, who I saw the other day, and we were talking about politics, and she said that she thought it was very surprising that I'd ended up on the right, because she said when I was at university, I was very left-wing.
Are you on the right?
Well, that's what she thinks, but if she's quite a lefty. But in terms of the modern day university experience, I mean, it's very different. It's much more fragmented, I think. I think the main problem with the modern university experience is that the enormous amounts of debt that students are expected to get themselves into in order to have their education. I mean, I didn't get a grant because my parents lived abroad, but because I'm British, I got my fees paid for. So, I left university with a bit of debt, but nothing sort of like anything like what they would have today. And I talked to my children's friends, and the thing is, they all hate this idea of the debt. They all feel it's a real milestone around their neck. And yet they have been indoctrinated to the point where they think they have to do a degree. So when I went to university, it was by no means essential to do a degree. You could go and do something else. You could go to Polytechnic.
No, but there were hardly any of us.
Exactly.
And when I started at York
so it's a tyranny.
In October 1970, there were 2,500 undergraduates in the university. I think there are now 25,000. The campus has become the size of a small town.
Yeah.
It's gigantic. You couldn't possibly know everybody as we knew everybody.
No.
The other thing was that when I went into this, it was still at the very end, the last flowering of the British grammar schools. And so an enormous number of the people who I was at university with had come from pretty modest backgrounds because of their talent and their educational ability.
So they were there because they
were there because you didn't have to explain things very much to people. It was you were actually in a sort of kingdom of the mind where people did know more than most people. Now I'm afraid that's not so, partly because the schools have got so much worse, and also because the places have got so much bigger. The debt is a nightmare, but how else were you ever going to pay for persuading people to be unemployed for an extra, 3 years of their lives? I've heard this described as raising the school leaving age to 21, and that's for about half the population what it has been.
Well, yeah.
But for what purpose? What do they get out of these degrees? In many cases, absolutely nothing at all.
There's terrible grade inflation, so they all have to get absurd A++++ a million times even to just get into the universities. But, when they get there, they actually get when we went, we weren't paying, right? So we just took what we were given, and there were good lecturers and bad lecturers and good stuff and bad stuff. And, we were probably very blasé about appreciating the level of education that we were getting. But now the universities provide a shockingly bad service. I mean, for example, Manchester is a case in point, but my son is at Cardiff. He's in his first year. He's got no more lectures.
Well, I know. This is why my answer to Mona is this: we should close most of them down.
Yeah, but I mean, he's quite interested in his subject. He would like to have more lectures. I mean, he could do his degree in 2 years if they just concentrated it.
You could do that, or you could have a much smaller number of universities where the courses were both valuable to the country and useful to those who took them, rather than just treading water for 3 years while you got into debt to get a degree which was compulsory for the most basic career, which it now is. Mona also raised the question of apprenticeships. Now, this is another thing. I actually was an indentured apprentice for the first 3 years of my working life. That's what you did when you first went into journalism. You became an indentured apprentice. That's what you were. And I would love to see apprenticeships back, but it's not nothing really to do with taxation. You can't have apprenticeships unless you've got places where people can do them.
Yeah.
And what we really don't have in this country anymore, by comparison, for instance, with Germany, is industries where people can learn. Yeah. And so what do you do? If I could have persuaded my children, I think sometimes it did occur to me quite strongly, I would have said, if you really want to have security and happiness and popularity for the rest of your lives, learn to be plumbers.
Well, yes, because they get paid a lot of money. But
it's tough. It's a tough thing to do. A lot of plumbers won't take people on, but it's actually quite difficult to do. But for many people, they would be much better off learning to be plumbers or electricians or things of that kind, rather than wasting their time on pseudo-academic courses which aren't of very high quality and which get them into debt.
But the thing is, what I would say also, so this idea that a university education is not useful is actually wrong, because, for example, my daughter struggled a lot at school. She has dyslexia and she has ADHD, and she has,
You do know that I do contend that both those things are non-existent fantasies, don't you?
You're wrong.
This isn't the time to argue about it, but I'm just pointing out that I'm buttoning my lip on that.
That's completely okay. You can, but she certainly has quite bad dyslexia. Anyway, so in terms of the sort of structure of school, she struggled because school is all about process and it's all about certain things. What she does have is a very active brain, and being at university has allowed her to develop that. And actually, she has really done well at university. I mean, she's really come into her own in a way that she hadn't by the time she left school, if you see what I mean. So I think further education, especially if you have a slightly different type of brain, which she does to yours, can be incredibly useful. I was the same. I was a very slow starter and didn't really thrive at school, but did really well at university for the simple fact that I was able to manage my own time, and I was allowed to have ideas, and I wasn't just meant to be repeating other people's ideas. It really worked for my type of brain, and it's really worked for my daughter's type of brain. So I don't think that this idea that, all these degrees are useless and pointless. The degree itself is not necessarily the end goal, but learning to think in a different way, learning to question things, learning to structure your ideas, learning to condense them.
How many university students learn to think or to question things?
I would say both of my children are learning that at university, which is interesting. So
they seem to me to be learning what to think. Much more than how to do so.
No. They're both quite, I suppose, intellectually combative and quite confident. So maybe that's part of it. But I don't think they're just being spoon-fed nonsense.
No, I think they're spoon-fed. But the universities are now strongholds of intolerance when they should be the opposite.
It's interesting that there's this perception that the universities are just full of sort of wokeism. But actually, I would say both my children's experience is the opposite. There are a few people who are like that, but the vast majority of people who are at university are actually quite interesting and, varied, and try to sort of, and don't really subscribe to that kind of stuff. But so I just think it's a great shame that this notion that actually getting a degree is worthless is not true. It's not about learning the information of the degree. It's about learning how to manage your mind and learning how to, order your thoughts or express them or write them down. And those are not things you learn in school anymore. They really aren't.
Well, no, you should though, shouldn't you?
Yeah. So
you can't have a remedial course at the end of your education to make up for the fact that you haven't had any education, which you then have to borrow something the size of a small mortgage to pay for. That should not be the arrangement in an intelligently run country, should it?
What should happen in intelligent? I mean, this is what you mentioned grammar schools earlier on.
I did.
I think in your day, and perhaps even a little bit in my day, you would get to the end of a grammar school education with probably the equivalent of a university education now.
Oh, very much the equivalent, better than, because it was better quality and broader. It used to be said in the 50s and early 60s that English A-levels was equivalent to an American college degree.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that's true. And I think the British university degree is now probably worth less than an American college degree.
Yeah, so what we're basically saying to kids is, look, the school system is rubbish, but go to university, which you, by the way, have to pay for, and then you'll get to the level that Peter Hitchens was at in 1970.
Well, you could say, don't put up with this rubbish anymore and change the country in intelligent ways so that this kind of thing isn't visited on your own children and grandchildren. Unless somebody does it, it's too late for me to influence it, then your children and grandchildren will be cheated even more badly by education than you've been.
But also I think there's a question of what is education for? Is it for the development of the mind and the intellect and all of those sort of things, or is it to get a job? Or is it both? I mean, should it?
Well, both. Just school should encompass both. But if you are not put in touch with the best that has ever been said, thought, and written, then you haven't had an education. And a lot of what you obtain or used to obtain at primary school was like learning how to count and do your times tables and measure and know the history of country and the world and its geography, that sort of thing, which people I don't think know now. And I'm amazed at the geographical ignorance of people. They don't know where places are in this country or abroad. And historical ignorance is just a great fog. People have no idea. They know about, or they think they know about the Second World War and about the Munich talks, and that's about it, I think. Oh, and the Tudors.
Everyone knows about the Tudors because they're fun. Yeah.
Well, they're on the TV
They're fun
a lot.
History.
Yeah, much misunderstood nonetheless.
So I do think that universities should be shrunk, like you, and I think that people should go back to being sent to university and have their fees paid for them. Because the other thing about universities is they have become great big money-making machines. I mean, one of the things that drives me absolutely insane is there's a total racket in accommodation around universities. Yes. So, for example, William has now finished basically his lectures for this year, but he's got to pay for his accommodation until August. I mean, that's just wrong.
It is a racket.
It's a total racket.
All university towns are in the grip of this.
Yeah, and all these
and although vast sums of money are demanded of it, it doesn't seem to me to be that stable as a part of the economy. A lot of these universities are tottering, I think.
Yeah, they are,
not
definitely. Well, I mean, Cardiff is a case in point. I mean,
the money they used to get.
William's degree, which is ancient history, is among one of the degrees that is being earmarked to be abolished, and yet it has some of the best lecturers in that field at that university. But
it's not bringing in any money.
But it's not making any money. But
this is absolutely not the way in which university should be conducted.
Exactly, because actually ancient history is quite an important thing to do. It's good that people are ancient historians, right? Not everybody can be whatever it is that they want now, a computer programmer or a physicist, or I don't know. And the bias towards sciences, because those are the subjects that bring in the money. It's cultural vandalism, really, because it shouldn't all just be about, how much the university chancellor can drag in from foreign students or whatever, and it's just depressing.
I think the whole thing is riding for a fall.
And universities,
a lot of these places, it doesn't matter what I say. A lot of these places will be gone in 20 years anyway.
But what's really interesting is a lot of my children's friends say that they would not ever want to go to Oxford or Cambridge because apparently it's just full of really boring kind of, swats these days.
You may well be.
A lot of them want to go to university to have an experience which is, finding their tribe, I don't know, sleeping with girls, etc. They don't just want to go because...
I say girls are important.
Girls are very important.
Let's never underestimate
They don't just want to go there because they want to get straight A's. And so the elite universities have ended up places where you just go... if you've got no personality at all and all you do all day long is advanced maths. I'm not saying that, sorry, I'm not being rude about mathematicians. I'm sure you're all fun and have a lot of personality.
I wouldn't know.
Anyway, do let us know what you think, and please join us after the break where Peter will be telling us all why we did not win the war.
Welcome back. I'm Peter Hitchens, and I'd like to discuss VE Day and the pseudo-religion of We Won the War, which seems to have the country in its grip.
Go on then.
Right, then I will. I thought you might want to challenge me straight away.
I'd like to hear your case
My late
first.
father was in the war, unquestionably in the war. He was a professional officer in His Majesty's Navy. He started the war in the Navy, he ended in the Navy, and he did a considerable chunk of it running guns backwards and forwards between and tanks between Scapa Flow in the Orkneys and Murmansk in North Russia, basically running guns to Joe Stalin, as my brother used to describe it, which had not, I think, ever been his ambition, but is what he found himself doing. He was very definitely in the war, and he lost a lot of friends in it, and he saw a lot of things in it that he didn't really want to talk about. In fact, I remember he used to say, when I asked him what it had been like on the Russian convoys, he wouldn't explain it to me, but I should read a book by Alistair MacLean called HMS Ulysses, which is actually a very, very interesting and graphic account of what it was like, and I could see why he didn't want to talk about it. So he seemed to me to be qualified. And as the years went by after the war, his life didn't greatly improve, and nor, I have to say, did that of many other people of his kind. And he used to say in conversation, well, so we won the war then, and then he would pause and then look meaningly at anybody who was listening and say, or did we? And I think he had a point, and the more I look at it, the more I think he had a point. This country in 1945 looked like a defeated country, not like a victorious one. It was impoverished, it was smashed up, broken, everybody was short of everything. Now, it's interesting to recognize, even after the First World War, which was in the end a disaster, at the end of that war, we had expanded our empire and looked more powerful than we'd ever been. At the end of the second, and after the great wars against the French in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the country became richer and evidently more powerful and influential. And the whole of our expansion into the greatest empire the world had ever seen was based upon the wealth and the naval power we got in those wars. After the Second World War was none of that.
No.
The place was a dump. Everything was rationed. There was worse rationing, I think, after the war for some time than there was during it.
Yeah.
Bread, I think, had to be rationed at one point, which is the most astounding thing in a supposedly advanced country. And this carried on being so for a very long time. He ended up not at all well off. His naval pension turned out not to be worth very much. And his general attitude towards it grew less and less happy. And I don't think this is particularly uncommon. And it caused me to think about it, and I did a bit of work on it, and I actually wrote a book a few years ago called The Phoney Victory, in which I went into this. Did you know, for instance, that for 4 years of a 6-year war, the British Army was not in contact with the main body of the German enemy?
No, I didn't know
4
that.
years.
Yeah.
We were stuck in our island, conducting second-hand wars as they were. They were just as bloody and nasty for those who were in them as they would have been if they'd been first time. But if you were in North Africa, say, or out in the Far East, the main enemy, which we had gone to war to fight, was beyond our reach, except we could bomb their cities.
Yeah.
Which was not, and I'll come back to that. So there's that. And then France having dropped out of the war, we ended up really having to hand over the conduct of the war and its whole direction to our new allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, neither of which necessarily had our best interests at heart. They finished the war on their terms.
Well, and we ended up owing America a vast amount of money.
Well, we paid that off.
Which we've now paid off.
What we haven't paid off, interestingly, is our First World War debt, which we defaulted on in 1934. A fact which is, every time I say it, is always disputed by people, but it's absolutely true.
Yeah.
We just pulled the plug.
I mean,
We've not paid a penny since we still owe it to them, and they still remember it. Don't be in any doubt. But it's fascinating to see that there are two countries in the world which have this complete idolization of the Second World War as a kind of holy scripture. One is us, and the other is Russia. Both we and Russia will be having immense, or have had immense, celebrations of the war. Very sentimental ones, very moving ones in many ways, and ones which you can't really say, well, it's wrong to commemorate the sacrifice of people, but ones which are increasingly, it seems to me, out of proportion to our positions in the world. Both Russia and Britain are greatly diminished.
I mean, I think the VE celebrations are really about the people. Genuinely, who remain. There aren't very many veterans left. I'd be interesting to know if this sort of celebration continues once the few remaining veterans have passed on. And I think there is a very acute sense, and I did write about this in my column today, actually, and I got a big post back, but there's a very acute sense of a Britain that stood for something that was brave in the world, that, you know, it was a country of people who would come together against a common evil. And I think people really miss that now, because I don't think people feel that that is the case anymore. And so I think it's, in a way, it's a love letter to that world that may not have ever really existed, but that is crystallized in the events of the Second World War, really, and in our response, and in, you know, figures like Churchill and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, my grandfather Arthur was, both my grandparents were in the war, and my grandfather Arthur was a Chindit, so he fought throughout the whole of Europe and North Africa and ended up in Burma, and he would have been the last person to glorify war.
Yeah, most of those who were actually in it were very reluctant to do so.
If he were alive today, he would not be celebrating the war, but he would be celebrating his men, and he would be celebrating, you know, that
Sarah, here's the thing. I read your very moving account of what happened to him, and here's the thing. He was fighting to win Burma back from the Japanese. And what happened was, within what I think 3 years of the end of the war, we left Burma forever.
Yeah,
we fought to regain something,
but
which we then didn't actually keep.
I completely agree. But the thing is, that experience destroyed his life.
Yeah,
effectively.
Horrible.
He became a very serious alcoholic, but also he must have had galloping PTSD. I'm not 100% sure about this, but from what I gather, at one point they were captured by the Japanese, and he was forced to execute several of his own men because he couldn't face what he knew would happen to them, and you know he went away. And then, having just got married to my grandmother, and he came back a totally different person. I mean, unrecognizable physically, mentally, all of those things. So what I remember when I think about VE Day and when I think about the Second World War is I remember his life and what he put up with and what he dealt with. And I don't want it to all have been for nothing. I mean, I know that what you say is true, and that technically it was for nothing.
It wasn't. I don't think I ever said it was for nothing. I think a lot of people fought for things which they believed anyway. They'd have fought for honour and duty and things which they very much believed in those days, which we don't so much believe in anymore. But here's the thing. This is a very simple quiz question. Why did we declare war in 1939?
Well, I'm assuming because we felt that we had to fight against the Germans.
Because we said we declared war in 1939 to save Poland from Poland was then overrun by both Germany and the Soviet Union. And at the end of the war, when the big victory parade was held, the Poles, who had played a huge part, I have to say, particularly in the Battle of Britain, but also their soldiers in winning the war, were not allowed to take part in the victory parade.
Because?
Because the Soviet Union, Stalin didn't want them to. He had other plans.
Well, I mean, that's politics.
It's a very interesting thing. The thing that we specifically fought the war for, not only did we not get, but Poland was in fact buried under dictatorship and horror for many, many years afterwards. It didn't achieve that objective. So the whole thing examined, it comes to pieces. I'm all in favour of courage and integrity and duty and all these things, but I'm not sure they can be made to continue to rest on this thing. So how long? And I looked up the other day the archives of some London newspapers for 1895, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, which really was a very, very serious victory. Almost no mention of it at all. And the mention is so complicated and abstruse that it would take me far too long to explain it. But it simply was not. There was no great grand national parade. No, it was 80 years in the past. Nobody thought that something 80 years before really needed to be celebrated. Why are we still 80 years afterwards go on about it?
Because I think it's a symptom. I agree with you. I think it's a symptom of a general feeling that people have, which is that they don't feel a sense of identity as British people anymore, so they're clinging to, it's like they cling to the BBC, they cling to that because it's easy to understand and it's clear.
But it isn't clear. Because what we have now it doesn't measure up. Now, have I told you about my father's medal?
No.
Right. My father got campaign medals, as you did. He didn't qualify for any of the other things. Who knows what he might or might not have done. But many, many years after the war, the British government decided it was going to actually mint a medal for those who'd taken part in the Russian convoys called the Arctic Star. My father had by then died, but I thought it was a filial duty. I would get hold of this medal and put it along with the other ones of his, which I still keep. And I applied for it, and I have to say everybody at the Ministry of Defence was very good and very nice and very helpful, and they looked up the records and found that he qualified for it, and after some months they sent it to me, and it came in a plastic case.
Yeah, no, that's insulting. It should come in a nice wooden box.
It should have come. People who get OBEs and whatever else for services to the theatre or so forth, they get it. It's a little plastic case, and it looks to me, set beside the medals that he actually was awarded at the end of the war in the 40s, it looks to me inferior in work and quality of metal. It just made me think we are being nostalgic about something which I'm not necessarily against, while not living up to it.
No, I completely agree. We're absolutely not. But you see, so a lot of people think this
just won't do.
But I think a lot of people think this was the last time that Britain was really great. This was when we knew what we were. We came together. We were brave. We were steadfast. We fought evil. That's why people like it, because it reminds them of all of that, and they miss it.
But the fighting evil business, you see, is more complicated. Remember, we ended the war as the ally of one of the most evil dictatorships ever to overshadow the earth.
Absolutely, and we were complicit in Hiroshima and all of these things. I'm not disputing any of that. I'm just saying that when you ask why you've asked, or you said, why is it that people are so obsessed with V-Day, I think that's the answer. I think it's something that they've lost that they wish they still had.
Well, I think I think they should try a real religion, and also I do think this is a great country. I think there are many things about it which are great, which we are neglecting and in some cases destroying, which we would be much better off commemorating than that complicated episode.
Yes, but I think also the number of the fact that the veterans are such a small number now, and that they are actually amazing and still quite moving and all of that kind of stuff. I think we are still going to go on with that journey.
Veterans are always moving, but let me put another thing to you which upsets me. When I lived in Moscow, there were still quite a few, this is in the early 1990s, still quite a few of the survivors of the Red Army which had actually torn the guts out of Hitler's army and destroyed Nazi Germany, and they would come out on Victory Day, which in Russia is the May 9th, and they would put their medals on, and they would get enjoyably drunk on the streets, and you could see these very, very tough old geezers, and it didn't matter that they'd been fighting for Joe Stalin. You thought, great, if you hadn't done it, we'd all have been finished. And a few years ago, we had a great, big, massive celebration, D-Day. Now, I don't care that Vladimir Putin wasn't invited. In fact, he shouldn't have been invited.
No, but we should have had some.
But there should have been some representatives of the Russian soldiers there.
Yeah,
because
agree.
Without them, there'd have been no D-Day.
But one of the other things that's very interesting is that there was that survey done earlier in the year by the Times of Gen Z, and one of the things that came out of it was that only 11% of Gen Z, which sort of is basically 18 to 30, would want to fight or defend their country's freedom. And I think that's another reason why certain type of person, sort of age group, sort of, I think that's because we look at the current generation and we think, well, they probably wouldn't.
But this is why the whole Munich story is so important in its way. And in September 1938, hardly anybody in Britain would have wanted to fight against Hitler.
I think you're right.
But because of what happened in the months afterwards, and partly because of Munich, the mood changed utterly, and people were ready to fight in 1939. Moods change when you see that you're faced with a genuine enemy, as people did then.
Yeah.
So don't take this mood as permanent. People are quite reasonably skeptical. Why should people want to go and have their heads and limbs blown off? It's not. But the moment comes when quite surprising people suddenly change their mind about that, and I think we should bear that in mind when looking at these surveys.
I agree. So I get what you're saying, but I think that I actually think it's a pretty harmless thing to do. Celebrate VE Day, on the whole. It doesn't upset or offend me.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
I
It doesn't
quite like the fly
upset or
pasts.
offend me. I just think that if people want to have, and people do need in their life some basis for a belief in higher things, then I actually think they should turn to genuine religion, not to actually a rather confused and ill-informed version of the past.
And on that note, I think we've run out of time. Thank you for listening to Alas, Vine and Hitchens. We will be back next week. Don't forget to check out this week's reading list and share the books you think we might want to read. For that or anything else, please contact us. You can email alas@mailonline.co.uk. You can leave a comment on Spotify or even send us a voice note on WhatsApp 07796 657 512. And please start your message with the word alas. And thank you for all of your messages so far. Thank you.